There we go. I'm so not used to it being a full black background. Howdy, y'all. Been a bit. Probably don't remember where we stopped, but back again to read some more. Specifically, Cabinet of Curiosities, the book you see before you. Where we last left off, Pendergast had discovered the note that they'd found, all sewn into that girl's dress, was written in blood. Gonna take a second to catch my breath, get a sip, and be cozy. Al phlegm, don't vex me now. Chapter 8. Silence descended in the museum office. Nora found she had to sit down. For some time, nothing was said. Nora could vaguely hear traffic sounds from below, the distant ringing of a phone, footsteps in the hall. The full dimension of the discovery began to sink in. The tunnel, the 36 dismembered bodies, the ghastly note from a century ago. What do you think it means? She asked. There can only be one explanation. The girl must have known she would never leave that basement alive. She didn't want to die an unknown. Hence, she deliberately wrote down her name, age, and home address, and then concealed it. A self-chosen epitaph. The only one available to her. Nora shuddered. How horrible! Pendergast moved slowly toward her bookshelf. She followed him with her eyes. What are we dealing with? She asked. A serial killer? Pendergast did not answer. The same troubled look that had come over him at the dig site had returned to his face. He continued to stand in front of the bookshelf. May I ask you a question? Pendergast nodded again. Why are you involved in this? 130-year-old serial killings aren't exactly within the purview of the FBI. Pendergast plucked a small Anasazi bowl from the shelf and examined it. Lovely Kayenta black on white. He looked up. How's your research on the Utah Anasazi survey going? Not well. The museum won't give me money for the carbon-14 dates I need. What does that have to... Good. Good? Dr. Kelly, are you familiar with the term Cabinet of Curiosities? Nora wondered at the man's ability to pile on non-sequiturs. Wasn't it a kind of natural history collection? Precisely. It was the precursor to the Natural History Museum. Many educated gentlemen of the 18th and 19th centuries collected strange artifacts while roaming the globe. Fossils, bones, shrunken heads, stuffed birds, that sort of thing. Originally, they simply displayed these artifacts in cabinets for the amusement of their friends. Later, when it became clear people would pay money to visit them, some of these cabinets' curiosities grew into commercial enterprises. They still called them Cabinets of Curiosities, even though the collection filled many rooms. What does this have to do with the murders? In 1848, a wealthy young gentleman from New York, Alexander Mirias, went on a hunting and collecting expedition around the world, from the South Pacific to Tierra del Fuego. He died in Madagascar, but his collection, most extraordinary collection they were, came back in the hold of a ship. They were purchased by an entrepreneur, John Canaday Shodom, who opened J.C. Shodom's Cabinet of Natural Productions and Curiosities in 1852. So? Shodham's cabinet was the building that once stood above the tunnel where the skeletons were found. How did you find all this out? Half an hour with a good friend of mine who works in the New York Public Library. The tunnel you explored was, in fact, the coal tunnel that serviced the building's original boiler. It was a 3-story brick building in the Gothic Revival style, popular in the 1850s. The first floor held the cabinet and something called a cyclorama. The second floor was Shodham's office, and the third floor was rented out. The cabinet seems to have been quite successful, though the Five Points neighborhood around it was at the time one of Manhattan's worst slums. The building burned in 1881. Shodham died in the fire. The police reports suspected arson, but no perpetrator was ever found. It remained a vacant lot until the row of tenement was built in 1897. What was on the site before Shodham's cabinet? A small hog farm. So all those people must have been murdered while the building was Shodham's cabinet. Exactly. Do you think Shodham did it? Impossible to know as of yet. Those glass fragments I found in the tunnel were mostly broken test tubes and distillation apparatus. On them, I found traces of a variety of chemicals that I have yet to analyze. We need to learn a great deal more about J.C. Shodham and his cabinet of curiosities. Pardon? I wonder if you would be so kind as to accompany me. He obligingly opened the door to her office, and Nora automatically followed him into the hallway. He continued talking as they walked down the hall and took an elevator to the 5th floor. As the elevator doors hissed open, Nora suddenly came to her senses. Wait a minute. Where are we going? I've got work to do. As I said, I need your help. Nora felt a short jolt of irritation. Pendergast spoke so confidently, as if he already owned her time. I'm sorry, but I'm an archaeologist, not a detective. He raised an eyebrow. Is there a difference? What makes you think I'd be interested? You already are interested. Nora fumed at the man's presumption, although what he said was perfectly true. Just how will I explain this to the museum? That, Dr. Kelly, is in the nature of our appointment. He pointed to a door at the end of the hall, with the name of the occupant in gold lettering on a wooden plaque. Oh no, groaned Nora. No. They found Roger Brisbane ensconced in his Baja chair, crisp Turnbull and Asher's shirt rolled up at the cuffs. Looking every inch the lawyer. His prized gems still nestled in their glass box. The only touch of warmth in the cold, immaculate office. He nodded toward 2 chairs opposite his desk. It did not look like Brisbane was in a good mood. Special Agent Pendergast, Brisbane said, glancing from his appointment book up to Pendergast without acknowledging Nora. Now, why is that name familiar? I've done work in the museum before, said Pendergast in his creamiest drawl. Who did you work for? You misapprehend. I said I did work in the museum, not for it. Brisbane waved his hand. Whatever. Mr. Pendergast, I enjoy my quiet mornings at home. I fail to see what the emergency was that required my presence in the office at such an hour. Crime never sleeps, Mr. Brisbane, Nora thought she detected a note of dry humor in Pendergast's voice. Brisbane's eyes veered toward Nora, then away again. Dr. Kelly's responsibilities are here. I thought I made that clear on the telephone. Normally, the museum would be delighted to help the FBI, but I just don't see how we can in this particular case. Instead of answering, Pendergast's gaze lingered on the gems. I didn't know the famous Mogul Star Sapphire had been taken off public display. That is the Mogul Star, is it not? Brisbane shifted in his chair. We periodically rotate the exhibits to give visitors a chance to see things that are in storage. And you keep the excess inventory here. Mr. Pendergast, as I said, I fail to see how we can help you. This was a unique crime. You have unique resources. I need to make use of those resources. Did the crime you mentioned take place in the museum? No. On museum property? Pendergast shook his head. Then I'm afraid the answer is no. Is that your final word on the subject? Absolutely. We don't want the museum mixed up in any way with the police work. Being involved in investigations, lawsuits, sordidness, is a sure way to draw the museum into unwelcome controversy. As you well know, Mr. Pendergast. Pendergast removed a piece of paper from his vest pocket and laid it in front of Brisbane. What's this? Brisbane said without looking at it. The museum's charter with the city of New York. What relevance is that? It states that one of the responsibilities of museum employees is to perform pro bono public service to the city of New York. We do that every day by running the museum. Ah, but that is precisely the problem. Up until fairly recently, the museum's anthropology department regularly assisted in the police in forensic matters. It was part of their duties, as a matter of fact. You remember, of course, the infamous Ashcan murder of November 7th, 1939? Pity. I must have missed that particular piece in the Times that day. A curator here was instrumental in solving that case. He found the burned rim of an orbit in an ash can, which he was able to identify as positively human. Mr. Pendergast, I am not here for a history lesson. Brisbane rose out of his chair and flicked on his jacket. The answer is no. I have business to attend to. Dr. Kelly, please return to your office. I am sorry to hear that. There will be adverse publicity, of course. At these two words, Brisbane paused. Then a cold smile crept onto his face. That sounded remarkably like a threat. Pendergast continued in his genial southern fashion. The truth is, the charter clearly calls for service to the city outside of regular curatorial duties. The museum has not been keeping its contract with the city of New York now for close to a decade, despite the fact that it receives millions in tax dollars from the citizens of New York. Far from providing public service, you have now closed your library to all but PhDs. You have closed your collections to everyone except so-called accredited academics. And you charge fees for everything, all in the name of intellectual property rights. You've even begun suggesting an admission fee, despite the fact that this is clearly barred by your charter. It says right here, for the creation of a museum of natural history for the city of New York, to be open and free to all members of the public, without restriction.
Let me see that.
Brisbane read it, his smooth brow contracting into the faintest wrinkle. Old documents can be so inconvenient, don't you think, Mr. Brisbane? Like the Constitution. Always there when you least want it. Brisbane let it drop to the desk, his face reddening for a moment before returning to its usual healthy pink. I'll have to take this up with the board. Pendergast smiled slightly. An excellent start. I think perhaps the museum can be left to work with this little problem out on its own. What do you think, Mr. Brisbane? Provided I am given what little help I need from Dr. Kelly. There was a silence. Then Brisbane looked up, a new look in his eyes. I see. And I assure you I will not take up an undue amount of Dr. Kelly's time. Of course you won't, said Brisbane. Most of the work will be archival in nature. She'll be on the premises and available should you need her. Brisbane nodded. We will do all we can to avoid unpleasant publicity. Naturally, all this would be kept confidential. Naturally, it is always best that way. I just want to add that Dr. Kelly did not seek me out. I have imposed this duty on her. She has already informed me she would rather be working on her potsherds. Of course. An opaque veil had dropped over Brisbane's face. It was hard for Nora to tell what he was thinking. She wondered if this little hardball play of Pendergast's was going to damage her prospects at the museum. It probably would. She darted a reproachful glance toward Pendergast. Where did you say you were from? Brisbane asked. I didn't. New Orleans. Brisbane immediately pushed himself back in his chair, and with a smile said, New Orleans. Of course. I should have known from the accent. You're a rather long way from home, Mr. Pendergast. Pendergast bowed, holding the door open for Nora. She stepped through it, feeling shocked. Down the hall, she halted and spoke to Pendergast. You totally blindsided me back there. I had no idea what you were up to until we were in Brisbane's office. I don't appreciate it. Pendergast turned his pale eyes on her. My methods are unorthodox, but they have one advantage. And what is that? They work. Yeah, but what about my career? Pendergast smiled. May I offer a prediction? For what it's worth, why not? When this is over, you will have been promoted. Nora snorted. Right. After you blackmailed and humiliated my boss, he's going to promote me. I'm afraid I don't suffer petty bureaucrats gladly. A very bad habit, but one I find hard to break. Nevertheless, you will find, Dr. Kelly, that humiliation and blackmail, when used judiciously, can be marvelously effective. At the stairwell, Nora paused once again. You never answered my question. Why is the FBI concerned with killings that are over a century old? All in good time, Dr. Kelly. For now, let it suffice to say that, on a purely personal level, I find these killings rather, interesting. Something in the way Pendergast said interesting sent the faintest of shudders through Nora. Men of science. This book works in a very fun way, and that it is broken up into different bits and bobs. Like, you could say like a different movie of sorts. Different short. You will hear multiple chapter ones. Chapter 1. The museum's vast central archives lay deep in the basement, reachable only through several sets of elevators, winding corridors, stairs, and passageways. Nora had never been to the archives before. She did not, in fact, know anybody who ever had. And as she descended deeper and deeper into the bowels of the museum, she wondered if, perhaps, she had made a wrong turn somewhere. Before accepting the job at the museum, she had taken one of the tours that threaded their way through its endless galleries. She had heard all of the statistics. Bless me. She had heard all the statistics. It was physically the largest museum in the world, consisting of 24 interconnected buildings built in the 19th century, forming a bizarre maze of more than 3,000 rooms and almost 200 miles of passageways. But mere numbers could not capture the claustrophobic feeling of the endless, deserted corridors. It was enough, she thought, to give the Minotaur a nervous breakdown. 2 seconds. She stopped, consulted her map, and sighed. A long brick passageway ran straight ahead, illuminated by a string of light bulbs and cages. Another ran off from it at right angles. Everything smelled of dust. She needed a landmark, a fixed point to get her bearings. She looked around. A padlocked metal door nearby had a weathered sign. Titanotheres. A door across the hall from it read Chalicotheres, and Taperoids. She checked the oversized map, finally locating her positions with difficulty. She wasn't lost. After all, it was just ahead and around the corner. Famous last words, she thought, walking forward, hearing the echoing rap of her heels against the concrete. She stopped at a massive set of oaken doors, ancient and scarred, marked Central Archives. She knocked, listening to the rap resound cavernously on the far side. There came a sudden rattle of papers, the sound of a dropped book, a great clearing of phlegm. A high-pitched voice called out, "Just a moment, please!" There was a slow shuffling, then the sound of numerous locks being unfastened. The door opened, revealing a short, round, elderly man. He had a vastly hooked red nose, and a fringe of long white hair descended from the gleaming dome above it. As he looked up at her, a smile of greeting broke out, dispelling the air of melancholy on his veined face. "Ah, come in, do come in," he said. "Don't let all these locks frighten you. I'm an old man, but I don't bite. Fortunate senex." Nora took a step forward. Dust lay everywhere, even on the worn lapels of the man's jacket. A lamp with a green shade cast a small pool of light on the old desk, piled high with papers. On one side sat an elderly royal typewriter, perhaps the only thing in the room not covered in dust. Beyond the desk, Nora could see cast-iron shelves laden with books and boxes, stretching back into a gloom as deep as the ocean. 2 seconds. And we're back. Let's start from there. Nora could see cast iron shelves laden with books and boxes stretching back into a gloom as deep as the ocean. In the dimness, it was impossible to judge how far the room extended. "Are you Reinhardt Puck?" Nora asked. The man set up a vigorous nodding, his cheeks and bow tie flapping in response. Bow tie. "At your service," he bowed, and for an alarmed moment, Nora thought he might reach out to kiss her hand. Instead, there was another loud sound of phlegm being forced against its will somewhere within his windpipes. "I'm looking for information on cabinets of curiosities," Nora continued, wondering if that was the correct pluralization. The man, busy relocking the door, glanced over, his rheumy eyes lighting up. "Ah! You've come to the right place. The museum absorbed most of the old cabinets of early New York. We have all their collections, their papers. Where shall we begin?" He slammed the last bolt home, then rubbed his hands together, smiling, clearly happy to be of service to someone. "There was a cabinet of curiosities in Lower Manhattan, known as Shodum's Cabinet." He wrinkled his brow. "Shodum's... Ah, yes. Yes, indeed. Quite popular these days." "Quite popular these days, Shodum's. But first things first. Please sign the register, and then we can get started." He motioned her to follow him around the desk, where he produced a leather-bound ledger, so old and rubbed that Nora was tempted to ask for a quill pen. She took the proffered ballpoint, wrote in her name and department. "Why all the locks and bolts?" she asked, handing back the pen. "I thought all the really valuable stuff, the gold and diamonds and the rest, was kept in the secure area." "It's the new administration. Added all this red tape after the unpleasantness a few years back. It's not as if we're all that busy, you know. Just researchers and doctoral candidates, or the occasional wealthy patron with an interest in the history of science." He returned the register, then shuffled over to a huge bank of old ivory light switches, big as clothes pegs, and snapped a few on. Deep in the vast space there was a flicker, then another, and a dim light appeared. Puck set off toward it at a slow hobble, his feet scraping on the stone floor. Nora followed, glancing up at the dark walls of shelving. She felt as if she were walking through a dark forest toward the distant glow of a welcoming cottage. "Cabinets of curiosities, one of my favorite subjects. You no doubt know. Delacorte's was the first cabinet, established in 1804. Puck's voice echoed back over his stooped shoulders. "It was a marvelous collection. A whale eyeball pickled in whiskey, a set of hippo teeth, a mastodon tusk found in a bog in New Jersey, and of course, the last dodo egg, of Rhodidus solitaire to be exact. The egg was brought back alive in a crate, but then, after they put it on display, it appeared to have hatched, and... aha! Here we are." He stopped, abruptly, reached up to drag a box down from a high shelf, and opened its lid. Instead of the Shodum's cabinet material Nora had hoped for, inside was a large eggshell, broken into 3 pieces. "There's no provenience on these things, so they didn't accession them into the main museum collection." "Accession? That's why we've got them here." He pointed reverently at the pieces of shell, licking his lips. "Delacorte's Cabinet of Natural History. They charged 25 cents admission. Quite a sum at the time." Replacing the box, He slid a thick 3-ring binder off an adjoining shelf and began flipping through it. What would you like to know about the Delacorte cabinet? It was actually Shodum's cabinet of natural production and curiosities that I was interested in. John Kennedy Shodum. Nora swallowed her impatience. It would clearly be useless to rush Mr. Puck. Yes, Shodum's. He resumed his shuffling down the rows of boxes, binders, and books. How did the museum acquire these cabinets? She asked. Once the museum opened, with free admission, it put most of them out of business. Of course, a lot of the stuff the old cabinets displayed were fakes, you know. But some of it held real scientific value. As the cabinets went bankrupt, McFadden, an early curator here, bought them up for the museum. Fakes, you said? Puck nodded portentously. Sewing 2 heads onto a calf, taking a whalebone and dyeing it brown, saying it came from a dinosaur. We have some of those. As he moved on to the next row, Nora hastened to keep up, wondering how to guide the flood of information in the direction she wanted. Cabinets were all the rage. Even P.T. Barnum once owned a cabinet known as Shooter's American Museum. Or Scudder's. Not Shooter. A slip up here or there. Scudder's American Museum. He added live exhibits. And that, young lady, was the beginning of his circus. Live exhibits? He displayed Joyce Heth, a wizened old black woman who Barnum claimed was George Washington's 161-year-old nurse, exposed as a fraud by the father of our own Tinbury McFadden. Tinbury McFadden? Nora was starting to panic. Would she ever get out of here? Tinbury McFadden, a curator here back in the late 19th century. He had a particular interest in cabinets of curiosities. Queer fellow. Just up and disappeared one day. I'm interested in Shodum's cabinet. John Kennedy Shodum. We're getting there, young lady, said Puck, with the slightest touch of irritation. We don't have much from Shodum's. It burned in 1881. Most of the stuff was collected by a man named Marises. Marises? I actually never learned how to pronounce that name. Let's go with Morasis. Alexander Morasis. I was reading it in the wrong character. Oh well, Nora said, hoping to keep his mind on the subject at hand. Now there was an odd fellow. Morasis came from a rich New York family. Died in Madagascar. I believe the chief made an umbrella out of his skin to protect his baby grandson from the sun. They followed a labyrinthine path between shelves groaning with papers, boxes, and bizarre artifacts. Puck snapped more ivory switches. More lights went on ahead of them, while others winked out behind him, leaving them in an island of light surrounded by a vast ocean of darkness. They came to an open area in the shelves where some large specimens stood on oak platforms. A woolly mammoth, shriveled but still huge. A white elephant. A giraffe, missing its head. Nora's heart sank when Puck stopped. Those old cabinets would do anything to draw the paying public. Take a look at this baby mammoth. Found freeze-dried in Alaska. He reached underneath it and pressed something. There was a soft click, and a trapdoor flopped open in the belly. This was part of a sideshow routine. A label said the mammoth had been frozen for 100,000 years, and that a scientist was going to thaw it out and try to revive it. Before the sideshow opened, a small man would climb in through the trapdoor. When the place had filled with spectators, another man, posing as a scientist, would come out and give a lecture and start warming the thing with a brazier. Then the man inside would start moving the trunk and making noises. Cleared the place out in seconds. Puck chuckled. People were a lot more innocent back then, weren't they? He reached under and carefully closed the trap door. Yes, yes, said Nora. This is very interesting, Mr. Puck, and I appreciate the tour. But I'm pressed for time, and I really would like to see the Shotum material now. We're here. Puck rolled a metal ladder into place, climbed up into the gloom, and descended with a small box. Otek queteke biti. Here's your Mr. Shotum. It wasn't the most interesting cabinet, I'm afraid. And since it burned, we don't have much from it. Just these few papers. Puck opened the box, peered inside. Great heavens, what a mess. He chuckled disapprovingly. I don't understand, considering... well... When you're done with these, I can show you the Delacourt papers. Much more comprehensive. I'm afraid there won't be time. At least, not today. Puck grunted with dissatisfaction. Nora glanced at him, felt a stab of pity for the lonely old man. Here's a letter from Tinbury McFadden, Puck said, plucking a faded paper from the box. Helped Shotum classify his mammals and birds. He advised a lot of the cabinet owners. Hired himself out. He rummaged some more. He was a close friend of Shotum's. Nora thought for a moment. Can I check out this box? Have to look at it in the research room. Can't let it leave the archives. I see. Nora paused, thinking. You said Tinbury McFadden was a close friend of Shotum's. Are his papers in here, too? Are they here? Good heaven! We've got mountains of his papers. And his collections. He had quite a cabinet himself. Only he never displayed it. Left it to the museum. But none of the stuff had any provenience, and was full of fakes. So they stuck it down here, for historical purposes. No scientific value, they said. Puck sniffed. Not worthy of the main collection. May I see it? Of course, of course! And Puck was shuffling off again in a new direction. Right around the corner! They stopped at last before two shelves. The upper was full of more papers and boxes. On top of one box was a promissory note, with a faded inventory of items transferred from J.C. Shotum to T.F. McFadden, as payment for services rendered and promised. The lower shelf was stuffed with a variety of curious objects. Glancing over them, Nora saw stuffed animals wrapped in wax paper and twine, dubious-looking fossils, a double-headed pig floating in a glass jeroboam, a dried anaconda curled into a giant 5-foot knot, a stuffed chicken with 6 legs and 4 wings, and a bizarre box made out of an elephant's foot. Puck blew his nose like a trumpet, wiped his eyes. Poor Tinbury would turn over in his grave if he knew that his precious collection ended up down here. He thought it had priceless scientific value. Of course, this was at a time when many of the museum's curators were amateurs with poor scientific credentials. Nora pointed to the promissory note. This seems to indicate Shotum gave McFadden specimens in exchange for his work. A standard practice. So some of these things came from Shotum's cabinet. Without a doubt. Could I examine these specimens, too? Puck beamed. I'll move all of it to the research room and set it up on the tables. When it's ready, I'll let you know. How long will it take? A day. His face reddened with the pleasure of being of use. Don't you need help moving these things? Oh, yes. My assistant Oscar will do it. Nora looked around. Oscar? Oscar Gibbs. He usually works in osteology. We don't get many visitors down here. I call him down for special work like this. This is very kind of you, Mr. Puck. Kind? The pleasure is all mine, I assure you, my dear girl. I'll be bringing a colleague. An uncertain look clouded Puck's face. A colleague? There are rules about that. What with the new security and all. He hesitated, almost embarrassed. Rules? Only museum staff allowed. The archives used to be open to everybody, but now we've been restricted to museum staff and trustees. Special Agent Pendergast is, connected with the museum. Agent Pendergast? Yes, that name's familiar. Pendergast. I remember him now. The southern gentleman. Oh, dear. A momentary look of distress crossed the man's face. Well, well, as you wish. I'll expect you both tomorrow at 9 o'clock. Yes, I realize pronounced McFadden as McFadden a couple times, and vice versa. Few things will be incorrect. Chapter 2. Patrick Murphy O'Shaughnessy sat in the precinct captain's office, waiting for him to get off the phone. He had been waiting 5 minutes, but so far Custer hadn't even looked in his direction, which was just fine with him. O'Shaughnessy scanned the walls without interest, his eyes moving from commendation plaques to departmental shooting trophies, lighting at last upon the painting on the far wall. It showed a little cabin in a swamp, at night, under a full moon, its windows casting a yellow glow over the waters. It was a source of endless amusement to the 7th Precinct that their captain, with all his mannerisms and his pretensions to culture, had a velvet painting proudly displayed in his office. There had been talk of getting an office pool together, soliciting donations for a less revolting replacement. O'Shaughnessy used to laugh along with them, but now he found it pathetic. It was all so pathetic. The rattle of the phone in its cradle brought him out of his reverie. He looked up as Custer pressed his intercom button. Sergeant Noyes, come in here, please. O'Shaughnessy looked away. This wasn't a good sign. Herbert Noyes, recently transferred from Internal Affairs, was Custer's new personal assistant and numero uno ass-kisser. Something unpleasant was definitely up. Almost instantly, Noyes entered the office, the usual unctuous smile breaking the smooth lines of his ferret-like head. He nodded politely to Custer, ignored O'Shaughnessy, and took the seat closest to the captain's desk, chewing gum, as usual. His skinny form barely made a dent in the burgundy-colored leather. He'd come in so fast, it was almost as if he'd been hovering outside. O'Shaughnessy realized he probably had been. And now, at last, Custer turned toward O'Shaughnessy. Paddy, he said in his high, thin voice, how's the last Irish cop on the force doing these days? O'Shaughnessy waited just long enough to be insolent, and then answered, It's Patrick, sir. Patrick, Patrick! I thought they called you Paddy, Custer went on, some of the hearty bluster gone. There are still plenty of Irish on the force, sir. Yeah, but how many are named Patrick Murphy O'Shaughnessy? I mean, is that Irish or what? That's like Cham Moyes Finkelstein, or Vinnie Scarpetta Godi della Gambino ethnic. Very ethnic. Hey, don't get me wrong. Ethnic's good. Very good, Noise said. I'm always saying we need diversity on the force, right? Sure, O'Shaughnessy replied. Anyway, Patrick, we've got a little problem here. A few days ago, 36 skeletons were uncovered at a construction site here in the precinct. You may have heard of it. I supervised the investigation myself. It's a Mogan Fairhaven development. You know them? Sure I do. O'Shaughnessy glanced pointedly at the oversized Mont Blanc fountain pen in Custer's shirt pocket. Mr. Fairhaven had given them as Christmas presents to all the precinct captains in Manhattan the year before. Big outfit. Lots of money. Lots of friends. Good people. Now, these skeletons, Patrick, are well over a century old. It's our understanding that some maniac back in the 1800s murdered these people and hid them in a basement. With me so far? O'Shaughnessy nodded. Have you had any experience with the FBI? No, sir. They tend to think working cops are stupid. They like to keep us in the dark. It's fun for them. It's a little game they play, said Noise, with a small bob of his shiny head. It was hard to make a crew cut look oily, but somehow Noise managed. That's exactly right, Custer said. You know what we're saying, Patrick? Sure. They were saying he was about to get some shit-stink assignment involving the FBI. That's what he knew. Good. For some reason, we've got an FBI agent poking around the site. He won't say why he's interested. He's not even local. From New Orleans. Believe it or not. But the guy's got pull. I'm still looking into it. The boys in the New York office don't like him any more than we do. They told me some stories about him, and I didn't like what I heard. Wherever this guy goes, trouble follows. You with me? Yes, sir. This guy's been calling all over the place. Wants to see the bones. Wants to see the pathologist's report. Wants everything under the sun. He doesn't seem to get that the crime's ancient history. So now, Mr. Fairhaven is concerned. He doesn't want this getting blown out of proportion, you see. You know? He's gonna have to rent those apartments. You get my drift? And when Mr. Fairhaven gets concerned, he calls the mayor. The mayor calls Commissioner Rocker. The commissioner calls the commander. And the commander calls me. Which means that now I'm concerned. O'Shaughnessy nodded. Which means now I'm supposed to be concerned. Which I'm not. Very concerned, said Noise. O'Shaughnessy allowed his face to relax into the most unconcerned of looks. So here's what's going to happen. I'm going to assign you to be this guy's NYPD liaison. You stick to him like a fly to her honey. I want to know what he's doing, where he goes, and especially what he's up to. But don't get too friendly with the guy. No, sir. His name is Pendergast. Special Agent Pendergast. Custer turned over a piece of paper. Christ, they didn't even give me his first name here. No matter. I've set up a meeting with you and him tomorrow, 2 p.m. After that, you stay with him. You're here to help him. That's the official line. But don't be too helpful. This guy's ticked off a lot of people. Here, read for yourself. O'Shaughnessy took the proffered file. Do you want me to remain in uniform, sir? Hell, that's just the point. Having a uniformed cop sticking to him like a limpet is going to cramp his style. You get me? Yes, sir. The captain sat back in his chair, looking at him skeptically. Think you can do this, Patrick? O'Shaughnessy stood up. Sure. Because I've been noticing your attitude recently. Custer put a finger to the side of his nose. A friendly word of advice. Save it for Agent Pendergast. Last thing you, of all people, need is more attitude. No attitude, sir. I'm just here to protect and serve. He pronounced serve in his best Irish brogue. Top of the morning to you, Captain. As O'Shaughnessy turned and left the office, he heard Custer mutter, "Wise ass," to Noyes. 3. A perfect afternoon to take in a museum, said Pendergast, looking up at a lowering sky. Patrick Murphy O'Shaughnessy wondered if it was some kind of joke. He stood on the steps of the Elizabeth Street precinct house, staring off into nowhere. The whole thing was a joke. The FBI agent looked more like an undertaker than a cop, with his black suit, blonde white hair, and movie cliché accent. He wondered how such a piece of work ever got his ass through Quantico. The Metropolitan Museum of Art is a cultural paradigm, Sergeant. One of the great art museums of the world. But of course, you knew that. Shall we go? O'Shaughnessy shrugged. Museums, whatever. He was supposed to stay with this guy. What a crappy assignment. As they descended the steps, a long gray car came gliding up from where it had been idling at the corner. For a second, O'Shaughnessy could hardly believe it. A Rolls. Pendergast opened the door. Drug seizure? O'Shaughnessy asked. No. Personal vehicle. Figures. New Orleans. They were all on the take down there. Now he had the guy pegged. Probably up here on some kind of drug business. Maybe Custer wanted in. That's why he put him, of all cops in the precinct, on this guy's ass. This was looking worse by the minute. Pendergast continued holding the door. After you. O'Shaughnessy slid in the back, sinking immediately into creamy white leather. Pendergast ducked in beside him. To the Metropolitan Museum, he told the driver. As the Rolls-Royce pulled away from the curb, O'Shaughnessy caught a glimpse of Captain Custer standing on the steps, staring after them. He resisted the impulse to flip him the bird. O'Shaughnessy turned to Pendergast and gave him a good look. Here's to success, Mr. FBI agent. He turned away to look out the window. There was a silence on the other side. The name is Pendergast, came the voice, softly. Finally. Whatever. O'Shaughnessy continued to look out the window. He allowed a minute to pass, and then he said, So, what's at the museum? Some dead mummies? I have yet to meet a live mummy, Sergeant. However, it is not the Egyptian department we are going to. A wise guy. He wondered how many more assignments he'd have like this. Just because he made a mistake 5 years ago, they all thought he was Mr. Expendable. Any time there was something funny coming down the pike, it was always, "We've got a little problem here, O'Shaughnessy, and you're just the man to take care of it." But it was usually just penny ante stuff. This guy on the rolls, he looked big time. This was different. This looked illegal. O'Shaughnessy thought of his long-gone father and felt a stab of shame. Thank God the man wasn't around to see him now. 5 generations of O'Shaughnessy's in the force, and now everything gone to shit. He wondered if he could hack the 11 more years required before an early severance package became available. "So what's the game?" O'Shaughnessy asked. No more sucker work. He was going to keep his eyes open and his head up on this one. He didn't want any stray shit to fall where he wasn't looking up. "Sergeant?" "What?" "There is no game." "Of course not." O'Shaughnessy let out a little snort. "There never is." He realized the FBI agent was looking at him intently. He continued looking away. "I can see that you're under misapprehension here, Sergeant," came the drawl. "We should rectify that at once. You see, I can understand why you jumped to that conclusion. 5 years ago, you were caught on a surveillance tape taking $200 from a prostitute in exchange for releasing her. I believe they call it a shakedown. Have I got that right?" O'Shaughnessy felt a sudden numbness, followed by a slow anger. Here it was again. He said nothing. What was there to say? It would have been better if they'd cashiered him. "The tape got sent to Internal Affairs. Internal Affairs paid you a visit. But there were differing accounts of what happened. Nothing was proven. Unfortunately, the damage was done. And since that time, you've seen your career, how should I put it, remain in stasis." O'Shaughnessy continued looking out the window, at the rush of buildings. "Remain in stasis? You mean go nowhere. And you've caught nothing since but a series of questionable assignments and gray area errands, of which you no doubt consider this one more." O'Shaughnessy spoke to the window, his voice deliberately tired. "Pendergast, I don't know what your game is, but I don't need to listen to this. I really don't." "I saw that tape," said Pendergast. "Good for you. I heard, for example, the prostitute pleading with you to let her go, saying that her pimp would beat her up if you didn't. Then I heard you insisting you take $200, because if you didn't, her pimp would assume she had betrayed him. But if you took the money, he would only think she'd bribed her way out of custody and spare her. Am I right? So you took the money." O'Shaughnessy had been through this in his own mind 1,000 times. What difference did it make? He didn't have to take the money. He hadn't given it to charity either. Pimps are beating up prostitutes every day. He should have left her to her fate. "So now you're cynical. You're tired. You've come to realize that the whole idea of protect and serve is farcical, especially out there on the streets, where there doesn't even seem to be right or wrong. Nobody worth protecting, and nobody worth serving." There was silence. "Are we through with this character analysis?" O'Shaughnessy asked. "For the moment. Except to say that, yes, this is a questionable assignment, but not in the way you're thinking." The next silence stretched into minutes. They stopped at a light, and O'Shaughnessy took an opportunity to cast a covert glance toward Pendergast. The man, as if knowing the glance was coming, caught his eye and pinned it. O'Shaughnessy almost jumped. He looked away so fast. "Did you, by any chance, catch the show last year? Costuming History?" Pendergast asked, his voice now light and pleasant. "What?" "I'll take that as a no. You missed a splendid expedition? Why is my brain? Exhibition. The Met is a fine collection of historical clothing dating back to the early Middle Ages. Most of it was in storage, but last year they mounted an exhibition showing how clothing evolved over the last 6 centuries. Absolutely fascinating. Did you know that all ladies of Louis the... I forgot my Roman numerals. 2 seconds. Of all the skills to forget, Roman numerals. Did you know that all ladies at Louis XIV's court at Versailles were required to have a 13-inch waist or less? And that their dresses weighed between 30 and 40 pounds? O'Shaughnessy realized he didn't know how to answer. The conversation had taken such a strange and sudden tack that he found himself momentarily stunned. I was also interested to learn that in the 15th century, a man's codpiece. This tidbit was mercifully interrupted by a screech of brakes as the Rolls-Royce swerved to avoid a cab cutting across 3 lanes of traffic. Yankee barbarians, said Pendergast mildly. Now, where was I? Ah, yes, the codpiece. The Rolls was caught in midtown traffic now, and O'Shaughnessy began to wonder just how much longer this ride was going to take. The great hall of the Metropolitan Museum was sheeted in Beaux Arts marble, decorated with vast sprays of flowers, and almost unbearably crowded. O'Shaughnessy hung back, while the strange FBI agent talked to one of the harried volunteers at the information desk. She picked up a phone, called someone, then put it down again, looking highly irritated. O'Shaughnessy began to wonder what this Pendergast was up to. Throughout the extended trip uptown, he said nothing about his intended plan of action. He glanced around. It was an Upper East Side crowd, for sure. Ladies dressed to the nines, clicking here and there in high heels. Uniformed schoolchildren lined up and well-behaved. A few tweedy-looking academics wandering about with thoughtful faces. Several people were staring at him disapprovingly, as if it was in bad taste to be in the Met wearing a police officer's uniform. He felt a rush of misanthropy. Hypocrites. Pendergast motioned him over, and they passed into the museum, running a gauntlet of ticket-takers in the process. Past a cast full of Roman gold, plunging at last into a confusing sequence of rooms crowded with statues, vases, paintings, mummies, and all manner of art. Pendergast talked the whole time, but the crowds are so dense, and the noise so deafening, O'Shaughnessy caught only a few words. They passed through a quieter suite of rooms full of Asian art, finally arriving in front of a door of shiny gray metal. Pendergast opened it without knocking, revealing a small reception area. A strikingly good-looking receptionist sat behind a desk of blonde wood. Her eyes widened slightly at the sight of his uniform. O'Shaughnessy gave her a menacing look. "May I help you?" she addressed Pendergast, but her eyes continued to flicker anxiously toward O'Shaughnessy. Sergeant O'Shaughnessy and Special Agent Pendergast are here to see Dr. Wellesley. Do you have an appointment? Alas, no. The receptionist hesitated. I'm sorry, Special Agent Pendergast, Federal Bureau of Investigation. At this, she flushed deeply. Just a moment. She picked up her phone. O'Shaughnessy could hear it ringing in an office just off the reception area. "Dr. Wellesley," the secretary said, "there is a Special Agent Pendergast from the FBI and a police officer here to see you." The voice that echoed out of the office was easily heard by all. It was a crisp, no-nonsense voice, feminine yet cold as ice, and so unrelievably English it made O'Shaughnessy bristle. "Unless they are here to arrest me, Heather, the gentleman can make an appointment like everyone else. I am engaged." The crash of her telephone hitting the cradle was equally unmistakable. The receptionist looked up at them with high nervousness. "Dr. Wellesley," but Pendergast was already moving toward the office from which the voice had issued. "This is more like it," O'Shaughnessy thought, as Pendergast swung open the door, placing himself squarely in the doorway. At least the guy, for all his pretensions, was no pushover. He knew how to cut through the bullshit. The unseen voice, laden with sarcasm, cut the air. "Ah, the proverbial copper with his foot in the door. Pity it wasn't locked so you could batter it down with your truncheon." It was as if Pendergast had not heard. His fluid, honeyed voice filled the office with warmth and charm. "Dr. Wellesley, I have come to you because you are the world's foremost authority on the history of dresses, and I hope you'll permit me to say your identification of the Greek peplus of Virginia was most thrilling to me personally. I have long had an interest in the subject." There was a brief silence. "Flattery, Mr. Pendergast, will at least get you inside." O'Shaughnessy followed the agent into a small but very well-appointed office. The furniture looked like it had come directly from the museum's collection, and the walls were hung with a series of 18th century watercolors of opera costumes. O'Shaughnessy thought they might be the characters of Figaro, Rosina, and Count Almaviva from The Barber of Seville. Opera was his soul, and his secret indulgence. He seated himself, crossing and then uncrossing his legs, shifting in the impossibly uncomfortable chair. No matter what he did, he still seemed to take up too much space. The blue of his uniform seemed unbearably gauche amid the elegant furnishings. He glanced back up at the watercolors, allowing the bars of an aria to go through his head. Wellesley was an attractive woman in her mid-40s, beautifully dressed. "I see you admire my pictures," she said to O'Shaughnessy, eyeing him shrewdly. "Sure," said O'Shaughnessy, "if you like dancing in a wig, pumps, and straitjackets." Wellesley turned to Pendergast. "Your associate has a rather queer sense of humor." "Indeed." "Now, what can I do for you, gentlemen?" Pendergast removed a bundle from under his suit, loosely wrapped in paper. "I would like you to examine this dress," he said, unrolling the bundle across the curator's desk. She backed up slightly in horror as the true dimensions of its filth were exposed to view. O'Shaughnessy thought he detected a peculiar smell. Very peculiar. It occurred to him that maybe, just maybe, Pendergast wasn't on the take. That this was for real. "Good Lord, please," she said, stepping farther back and putting a hand before her face. "I do not do police work. Take this revolting thing away." "This revolting thing, Dr. Wellesley, belonged to a 19-year-old girl who was murdered over 100 years ago, dissected, dismembered, and walled up in a tunnel in lower Manhattan. Sewn up into the dress was a note, which the girl wrote in her own blood. It gave her name, age, and address. nothing else. Ink of that sort does not encourage prolixity. It was the note of a girl who knew she was about to die. She knew that no one would help her. No one would save her. Her only wish was that her body be identified, that she not be forgotten. I could not help her then, but I'm trying to now. That is why I'm here. The dress seemed to quiver slightly, and O'Shaughnessy realized with a start that the FBI agent's hand was trembling with emotion. At least, that's how it looked to him. That a law officer would actually care about something like this was a revelation. The silence that followed Pendergast's statement was profound. Without a word, Wellesley bent down over the dress, fingered it, turned up its lining, gently stretched the material in several directions. Reaching into a drawer of her desk, she pulled out a large magnifying glass and began examining the stitching and fabric. Several minutes passed. Then she sighed and sat down in her chair. Oop, hit my mic. Pardon. This is a typical workhouse garment, she said. Standard issue in the latter part of the 19th century. Cheap woolen fabric for the exterior. Scratchy and coarse, but actually quite warm. Lined with undyed cotton. You can see from the pattern cuts and stitching that it was probably made by the girl herself, using fabric issued to her by the workhouse. The fabrics came in several basic colors: green, blue, gray, and black. Any idea which workhouse? Impossible to say. 19th century Manhattan had quite a few of them. They were called houses of industry. They took in abandoned children, orphans, and runaways. Harsh, cruel places, run by the so-called religious. Can you give me a more precise date on the dress? Not with any accuracy. It seems to be a rather pathetic limitation of a style popular in the early 1880s, called a mauve mackin. Workhouse girls usually tried to copy dresses they liked out of popular magazines and penny press advertisements. Dr. Wellesley sighed, shrugged. That's it, I'm afraid. If anything else comes to mind, I can be contacted through Sergeant O'Shaughnessy here. Dr. Wellesley glanced up at O'Shaughnessy's name tag, then nodded. Thank you for the time. And the FBI agent began rolling up the dress. That was a lovely exhibition you curated last year, by the way. Dr. Wellesley nodded again. Unlike most museum exhibitions, it had wit. Take the Hopalin section. I found it delightfully amusing. Concealed in its wrapper, the dress lost its power to horrify. The feeling of gloom that had settled over the office began to lift. O'Shaughnessy found himself echoing Custer. What was an FBI agent doing messing around with a case 120 years old? Thank you for noticing what none of the critics did, the woman replied. Yes, I meant it to be fun. When you finally understand it, human dress, beyond what is necessary for warmth and modesty, can be marvelously absurd. Pendergast stood. Dr. Wellesley, your expertise has been most valuable. Dr. Wellesley rose as well. Please, call me Sophia. O'Shaughnessy noticed her looking at Pendergast with new interest. Pendergast bowed and smiled. Then he turned to go. The curator came around her desk to see him through the waiting room. At the outer door, Sophia Wellesley paused, blushed, and said, I hope to see you again, Mr. Pendergast. Perhaps soon. Perhaps for dinner. There was a silence. Brief. Pendergast said nothing. Well, said the curator crisply, you know where to reach me. They walked back through the thronged, treasure-laden halls, past the chimeric devatars, past the reliquaries encrusted with gems, past the Greek statues and the red attic vases, down the great crowded steps to Fifth Avenue. O'Shaughnessy whistled an astringent little chorus of Sade's Smooth Operator. If Pendergast heard, he gave no sign. Moments later, O'Shaughnessy was sliding into the white leather cocoon of the rolls, when the door shut with a solid, reassuring thunk. Blessed silence returned. He still couldn't figure out what to make of Pendergast. Maybe the guy, for all his expensive tastes, was on the up and up. He sure as hell knew this. He sure as hell knew this. He was going to keep his eyes and ears open. Across the park to the New York Museum of Natural History, please, Pendergast told the driver. As the car accelerated into traffic, the agent turned to O'Shaughnessy. How is it that an Irish policeman came to love Italian opera? O'Shaughnessy gave a start. When had he mentioned opera? You disguise your thoughts poorly, Sergeant. While you were looking at the drawings from the Barber of Seville, I saw your right index finger unconsciously tapping the rhythm to Rosina's aria. Una voce poco fa. O'Shaughnessy stared at Pendergast. I bet you think you're a real Sherlock Holmes. One does not often find a policeman with a love of opera. What about you? You like opera? O'Shaughnessy threw the question back at him. I loathe it. Opera was the television of the 19th century. Loud, vulgar, and garish, with plots that could only be called infantile. For the first time, O'Shaughnessy smiled. He shook his head. Pendergast, all I can say is your powers of observation aren't nearly as formidable as you seem to think. Jesus, what a Philistine. His smile widened as he saw a look of irritation cloud the FBI agent's face for no more than an instant. He had finally gotten to him. Chapter 4. Nora ushered Pendergast and the dour-looking little policeman through the doorway of Central Archives. A little relieved she'd had no more trouble finding her way this time. Pendergast paused inside the door, inhaling deeply. Ah, the smell of history. Drink it in, Sergeant. He put out his hands, fingers extended, as if to warm them on the documents within. Reinhardt Puck advanced toward Pendergast, head wagging. He wiped his shining pate with a handkerchief, then stuffed the cloth into a pocket with awkward fingers. The sight of the FBI agent seemed to both please and alarm him. Dr. Pendergast, he said. A pleasure. I don't think we've met since, let's see, the troubles of '95. Did you take that trip to Tasmania? I did indeed. Thank you for remembering. And my knowledge of Australian flora has increased proportionately. And how's your department? Splendid, said Pendergast. Allow me to introduce Sergeant O'Shaughnessy. The policeman stepped out from behind Pendergast, and Puck's face fell. Oh, dear. There is a rule, you see. Non-museum employees... I can vouch for him, said Pendergast. a note of finality in his voice. "He is an astounding member of the police force of our city." "I see. I see," Puck said unhappily, as he worked the locks. "Well, you'll have to sign in, you know." He turned away from the door. "And this Mr. Gibbs." Oscar Gibbs nodded curtly. He was small, compact, and African American, with hairless arms and a closely shaven head. For his size, his build was so solid he seemed fashioned out of a butcher block. He was covered with dust and looked distinctly unhappy to be there. "Mr. Gibbs has kindly set up everything for you in the research room," said Puck. "We'll go through the formalities, and then, if you'll be so good as to follow me." They signed the book, then advanced into the gloom, Puck lighting the way, as before, by the banks of ivory switches. After what seemed an interminable journey, I'm just not on my A game tonight, my apologies, y'all. They arrived at a door set into the plastered rear wall of the archives, with a small window of glass and metal meshing. With a heavy jangle of keys, Puck laboriously unlocked it, then held it open for Nora. She stepped inside. The lights came up, and she almost gasped in astonishment. Polished oak paneling rose from a marble floor to an ornate, plastered and gilded ceiling of rococo splendor. Massive oaken tables with clawed feet dominated the center. Of the room, surrounded by oak chairs with red leather seats and backs. On each table sat a small leather-sided box, containing special pencils and paper for note-taking. Heavy chandeliers of worked copper and crystal hung suspended above each table. 2 of the tables were covered by a variety of objects, and a third had been laid out with boxes, books, and papers. A massive, bricked-up fireplace, surrounded by pink marble, stood at the far end of the room. Everything was hoary with the accumulated patina of years. "This is incredible," said Nora. "Yes, indeed," said Puck. "One of the finest rooms in the museum. Historical research used to be very important." He sighed. "Times have changed. O tempo, o mores, and all that. Please remove all writing instruments from your pockets and put on those linen gloves before handling any of the objects. I will need to take your briefcase, Doctor." He glanced disapprovingly at the gun and handcuffs dangling from O'Shaughnessy's service belt, but said nothing. They laid their pens and pencils in a proffered tray. Nora and the others slid on pairs of spotless gloves. "I will withdraw. When you are ready to leave, call me on the telephone. Extension 4240. If you want photocopies of anything, fill out one of these sheets." The door eased shut. There was the sound of a key turning in a lock. "Did he just lock us in?" O'Shaughnessy asked. Pendergast nodded. "Standard procedure." O'Shaughnessy stepped back into the gloom. He was an odd man, Nora thought. Quiet, inscrutable. Handsome in a black Irish kind of way. Pendergast seemed to like him. O'Shaughnessy, on the other hand, looked as if he didn't like anybody. The agent clasped his hands behind his back and made a slow circuit of the first table, peering at each object in turn. He did the same with the second table, then moved to the third table, laden with its assorted papers. "Let's see this inventory you mentioned," he said to Nora. Nora pointed out the promissory notes with the inventory she had found the day before. Pendergast looked it over, and then, paper in hand, made another circuit. He nodded at a stuffed okapi. That came from Shodum's, he said. And that. He nodded to the elephant's foot box. Those 3 penis sheaths and the right whale baculum. The Javaro's shrunken head. All from Shodum's. Payment to McFadden for his work. He bent down to examine the shrunken head. A fraud. Monkey. Not human. He glanced up at her. Dr. Kelly, would you mind looking through the papers while I examine these objects? Nora sat down at the third table. There was a small box of Shodum's correspondence, along with another, much larger box, and 2 binders. McFadden's papers, apparently. Did it again. Nora opened the Shodum's box first. As Puck had noted, the contents were in a remarkable state of disarray. What few letters were here were all in the same vein. Questions about classifications and identifications. Tiffs with other scientists over various arcane subjects. It illuminated a curious corner of 19th century natural history, but shed no light on a heinous 19th century crime. As she read through the brief correspondence, a picture of J.C. Shodum began to form in her head, in her mind. It was not the image of a serial killer. He seemed a harmless enough man. Fussy, narrow, a little querulous perhaps, bristling with academic rivalries. The man's interests seemed exclusively related to natural history. Of course, you could never tell, she thought, turning over the musty pages. Finding nothing of particular interest, Nora turned to the much larger and neater boxes of Tinbury McFadden's correspondence. They were mostly notes from the long-dead curator on various odd subjects, written in a fanatically small hand. Lists of classifications of plants and animals, drawings of various flowers, some quite good. At the bottom was a thick packet of correspondence to and from various men of science and collectors, held together by an ancient string that flew apart when she touched it. She stifled through them, arriving finally at a packet of letters from Shodum to McFadden. The first began, "My esteemed colleague, I herewith transmit to you a curious relic said to be from the Isle of Kut, off the coast of Indochine, depicting a simian in coito with a Hindu goddess, carved from walrus ivory. Would you be so kind as to identify the species of simian? Your colleague, J.C. Shodum." She slid out the next letter. "My dear colleague, at the last meeting of the Lyceum, Professor Blackwood presented a fossil which he claimed was a Devonian age crinoid from the Montmorency Dolomites. The professor is sadly mistaken. Lafleur himself identified the Montmorency Dolomites as Permian, and needs make a corrective note of it in the next Lyceum bulletin." She flipped through the rest. There were letters to others as well, a small circle of like-minded scientists, including Shodum. They were all obviously well acquainted with one another. Perhaps the killer might be found in that circle. It seemed likely, since the person must have had easy access to Shodum's cabinet, if it wasn't Shodum himself. She began to make a list of correspondence and the nature of their work. Of course, it was always possible this was a waste of time, that the killer might have been the building's janitor or coal man. But then she remembered the crisp, professional scalpel marks on the bones, the almost surgical dismemberments. No, it was a man of science. That was certain. Taking out her notebook, she began noting notes. Letters to/from Tinbury McFadden. Correspondence, subject of correspondence, position, and date of correspondence. J.C. Shodom, Natural History, Anthropology, the Lyceum. Owner, Shodom's Cabinet of Natural Productions and Curiosities, New York, 1869 to 1881. Professor Albert Blackwood, Lyceum, the Museum. Founder, New York Museum of Natural History, 1865 to 1878. Dr. Asa Stone Gilcrease. Birds. Ornithologist, New York, 1875 to 1887. Colonel Sir Henry C. Throckmorton, Bart. FRS. African mammals, in brackets, big game. Collector, explorer, sportsman, London, 1879-1891. Professor Enoch Lang. Classification, taxonomist, chemist, New York, 1872 to 1881. Taxonomist. Miss Guinevere LaRue. Christian missions for Barabola, Ga, in the African Congo. Philanthropist, New York, 1870 to 1872. Barabola. There we go. Dumont Burlet. Dinosaur fossils. The Lyceum. Oilman. Collector, Cold Spring, New York, 1875 to 1881. Dr. Ferdinand Hunt. Anthropology. Archaeology. Surgeon. Collector. Oyster Bay, Long Island, 1869 to 1879. Professor Hiram Howlett. Reptiles and Amphibians. Herpetologist. Stormhaven, Maine, 1871 to 1873. The penultimate name gave her pause. A surgeon. Who was Dr. Ferdinand Hunt? There were quite a few letters from him, written in a large scrawl on heavy paper with a beautifully engraved crest. She flipped through them. My dear Tinbury, with regard to the Odinga natives, the barbaric customs of male partum is still quite prevalent. When I was in the Volta, I had the dubious privilege of witnessing childbirth. I was not allowed to assist, of course, but I could hear the shrieks of the husband quite clearly as the wife jerked on the rope affixed to his genitalia with every contraction he experienced. I treated the poor man's injuries, severe lacerations, following the birth. My dear Tinbury, the Olmec jade phallus I herewith enclose from Laventa, Mexico, is for the museum. As I understand, you have nothing from that extremely curious Mexican culture. She sorted through the packets of correspondence, but it was again all in the same vein. Dr. Hunt describing various bizarre medical customs he had witnessed in his travels across Central America and Africa, along with notes that had apparently accompanied artifacts sent back to the museum. He seemed to have an unhealthy interest in native sexual practices. It made him a prime candidate in Nora's mind. She felt a presence behind her and turned abruptly. Pendergast stood, arms clasped behind his back. He was staring down at her notes, and there was a sudden look on his face that was so grim, so dark, that Nora felt her flesh crawl. "You're always sneaking up on me," she said weakly. "Anything interesting?" The question seemed almost a performer. Nora felt sure he had already discovered something important, something dreadful on the list, and yet he did not seem inclined to share it. Nothing obvious. "Have you heard of this Dr. Ferdinand Hunt?" Pendergast gave the name a cursory glance, without interest. Nora became aware of the man's conspicuous lack of any scent whatsoever. No smell of tobacco, no smell of cologne, nothing. Hunt, he said, finally. Yes. A prominent North Shore family. One of the early patrons of the museum. He straightened up. I've examined everything save the elephant's foot box. Would you care to assist me? She followed him over to the table laid out with Tinbury McFadden's old collection. A decidedly motley assortment. Pendergast's face had once again recovered its poise. Now, Officer O'Shaughnessy, looking skeptical, emerged from the shadows. Nora wondered what, exactly, the policeman had to do with Pendergast. They stood before the large, grotesque elephant's foot, replete with brass fittings. So this is an elephant's foot, O'Shaughnessy said. So? Not just a foot, Sergeant, Pendergast replied. A box, made from an elephant's foot. Quite common among big game hunters and collectors in the last century. Rather a nice specimen, too, if a little worn. He turned to Nora. Shall we look inside? Shall we look inside? There we go. Nora unclasped the fittings and lifted the top of the box. The grayish skin felt rough and nubbled beneath her gloved fingers. An unpleasant smell rose up. The box was empty. She glanced over at Pendergast. If the agent was disappointed, he showed no sign. For a moment, the little group was still. Then Pendergast himself bent over the open box. He examined it a moment, his body immobile save for the pale blue eyes. Then his fingers shot forward and began moving over the surface of the box, pressing here and there, alighting at one spot for a moment, then scuttling on. Suddenly, there was a click, and a narrow drawer shot out from below, raising a cloud of dust. Nora jumped at the sound. Rather clever, said Pendergast, removing a large envelope, faded and slightly foxed, from the drawer. He turned it over once or twice, speculatively. Then he ran a gloved finger beneath the seam, easing it open and withdrawing several sheets of cream-laid paper. He unfolded them carefully, passed his hand across the topmost sheet, and then he began to read. There's my sip. Almost tipped it over. Chapter 5. To my colleague, Tinbury McFadden, July 12, 1881. Esteemed colleague, I write these lines in earnest hope that you will never have need to read them, that I will be able to tear 'em up and dash 'em into the coal scuttle, products of an overworked brain and fevered imagination. And yet, in my soul, I know my worst fears have already been proven true. Everything I have uncovered points incontrovertibly to such a fact. I have always been eager to think the best of my fellow man. After all, are we not all molded from the same clay? The ancients believed life to have generated spontaneously within the rich mud of the Nile, and who am I to question the symbolism, if not the scientific fact of such belief? And yet, there have been events. McFadden, dreadful events that can support no innocent explanation. It is quite possible that the details I relate herein may cause you to doubt the quality of my mind. Before I proceed, let me assure you that I am in full command of my faculties. I offer this documentation as evidence, both to my dreadful theorem and to the proofs I have undertaken in its defense. I have spoken before of my growing doubts over this business of Lang. You know, of course, the reasons I allowed him to take rooms on the third floor of the cabinet. His talks of the Lyceum proved the depth of his scientific and medical knowledge. In taxonomy and chemistry he has few, if any, peers. The notion that enlightening, perhaps even forward-reaching, experiments would be taking place beneath my own roof was a pleasant one. And, on a practical note, the additional hard currency offered by his rent was not unwelcome. At first, my trust in the man seemed fully justified. His curatorial work at the cabinet proved excellent, although he kept highly irregular hours. He was unfailingly polite, if even a little reserved. He paid his rent money promptly, and even offered medical advice during the bouts of gripe that plagued me throughout the winters of '73 and '74. It is hard to date with any precision my first glimmerings of suspicion. Perhaps it began with what, in my perception, was a growing sense of secretiveness about the man's affairs. Although he had promised early on to share the formal results of his experiments, except for an initial joint inspection when the lease was signed, I was never invited to see his chambers. As the years passed, he seemed to grow more and more absorbed in his own studies, and I was forced to take on much of the curatorial duties for the cabinet myself. I had always believed Lang to be rather sensitive about his work. You will no doubt recall the early and somewhat eccentric talk on bodily humors he presented to the Lyceum. It was not well received. Some members even had the ill breeding to titter on one or two occasions. Pardon me. Excuse me. During the lecture, and henceforth Lang never returned to the subject. His future talks were all models of traditional scholarship, so at first I ascribed his hesitancy to discuss personal work to the same innate circumspection. However, as time went on, I began to realize that what I had thought to be professional shyness was, in fact, active concealment. One spring evening earlier this year, I had occasion to stay on very late at the cabinet, finishing work on an accumulation of documents and preparing the exhibition space for my latest acquisition. The double-brained child, of which we had previously spoken, this latter task proved far more engrossing than the tiresome paperwork, and I was rather surprised to hear the city bell toll midnight. It was in the moments following, as I stood, listening to the echoes of the bell die away, that I became aware of another sound. It came from over my head, a kind of heavy shuffling, as of a man bearing some heavy burden. I cannot tell you why precisely, McFadden, but there was something in that sound that sent a thrill of dread coursing through me. I listened more intently. The sound died away, slowly, the footsteps retreating into a more distant room. Of course, 2 seconds. There we go. Where was I? Of course, there was nothing for me to do. In the morning, as I reflected on the event, I realized the culprit was undoubtedly my own tired nerves, unless some more sinister meaning should prove to be attached to the footsteps, which seemed a remote possibility. There was no cause for approaching Lang on the matter. I ascribed my alarm to my own perverse state of mind at the time. I had succeeded in creating a rather sensational backdrop for displaying the double-brained child, and no doubt this, along with the late hours, had aroused the more morbid aspects of my imagination. I resolved to put the matter behind me. It chanced that some few weeks later, the 5th of July last week, to be precise, another event took place to which I most earnestly commend your attention. The circumstances were similar. I remained late at the cabinet, preparing my upcoming paper for the Lyceum Journal. As you know, writing for learned bodies such as the Lyceum is difficult for me, and I have fallen into certain routines, which eases the process somewhat. My old teakwood writing desk, the fine vellum paper upon which this note is now being written, the fuchsia-colored ink made by M. Dupin in Paris, or Dupin. These are the petty niceties which make composition less onerous. This evening, inspiration came rather more easily than usual, however, and around 10:30 I found it necessary to sharpen some new pens before work could continue. I turned away from my desk briefly to effect this. When I returned, I found, to my utmost astonishment, that the page on which I had been at work had been soiled with some small number of ink stains. I am most fastidious with a pen, and was at a loss to explain how this came about. It was only when I took up my blotter to clear away the stains that I realized they differed slightly in color from the fuchsia of my pen, being a somewhat lighter shade. And when I blotted them aside, I realized they were of a thicker, more viscous consistency than my French ink. Imagine my horror, then, when a fresh drop landed upon my wrist as I was in the act of lifting the blotter from the paper. Immediately, I lifted my eyes to the ceiling above my head. What devilment was this? A small but widening crimson stain was leaching between the floorboards of Lang's chambers overhead. It was the work of a moment to mount the stairs and pound upon his door. I cannot describe precisely the sequence of thoughts that ran through my mind. Foremost among them, however, was fear that the doctor had fallen victim to foul play. There had been rumors circulating through the neighborhood of a certain vicious and predatory murderer. But one pays little heed to the gossip of lower classes, and, alas, death is a frequent visitor to the 5 Points. Lang answered my frantic summons in due course. Sounding a trifle winded. An accident, he said, through the door. He'd cut his arm rather severely during an experimental procedure. He declined my offer of assistance, and said he had already done the necessary suturing himself. He regretted the incident, but refused to open the door. At last I went away, riven by perplexity and doubt. The morning following, Lang appeared at my doorstep. He had never called on me at my residence before, and I was surprised to see him. I observed that one arm had been bandaged. He apologized profusely for the inconvenience of the previous night. I invited him inside, but he would not stay. With another apology, he took his leave. I watched with unsettled heart as he descended the walk and stepped into an omnibus. I pray you will do the honor of understanding me when I say that Lang's visit, coming upon the heels of such strange events at the cabinet, had precisely the opposite effect to which he had intended. I felt now more sure than ever that whatever it was he was about, it would not stand up to scrutiny in the honest light of day. I fear I can write no more this evening. I will hide this letter inside the elephant's foot box that, along with a group of curiosities, is being forwarded to you at the museum in 2 days' time. God willing, I will find the fortitude to return to this and conclude it on the morrow. July 13th, 1881. I must now summon the strength of will to complete my narrative. In the aftermath of Lang's visit, I found myself in the grip of a terrific internal struggle. A sense of scientific idealism, coupled perhaps with prudence, argued that I should take the man's explanation at its face value. Yet another inner voice argued that it was beholden on me, as a gentleman and a man of honor, to learn the truth for myself. At last, I resolved to discover the nature of the man's experiments. If they proved benign, I could be accused of inquisitiveness. Nothing more. Perhaps you will consider me the victim of unmanly feelings in this matter. I can only say that those vile crimson drops now seem to have imprinted upon my brain as they had been upon my wrist and my writing paper. There was something about Lang, but the manner in which he had looked at me, there upon my doorstep, that made me feel almost a stranger in my own home. There was some manner of chill speculativeness behind those indifferent-looking eyes that froze my blood. It could no longer tolerate having that man under my roof, without knowing the full breadth of his work. By some personal caprice unfathomable to me, Lang had recently begun donating his medical services to a few local houses of industry. As a result, he was invariably absent from his chambers during the latter part of the afternoon. It was on Monday last, July 11th, that I saw him through the front windows of the cabinet. He was crossing the avenue, clearly on his way to the workhouses. I knew this was no accident. Fate had offered me this opportunity. It was with some trepidation that I ascended to the 3rd floor. Lang had changed the lock on the door leading into his room, but it retained a skeleton key, which turned the wards and unshot the bolt. I let the door fall open before me, and stepped inside. Lang had decorated the front room into the semblance of a parlor. I was struck by his choice of decoration. Gaudy sporting prints were on the walls, and the tables were a-clutter with tabloids and penny dreadfuls. Lang had always struck me as a man of elegance and refinement, yet this room seemed to reflect the tastes of uncultured youth. It was the sort of dive a pool-room tramp or a girl of low breeding would find inviting. There was a pall of dust over everything, as if Lang had spent little time in the parlor of late. A heavy brocade curtain had been hung over the doorway leading into the rear rooms. I lifted it aside with the end of my walking stick. Ow! I thought I had been prepared for almost anything, but what I found was, perhaps, what I least expected. The room was almost entirely empty. There were at least a dozen large tables, here and there, whose scarred surfaces bore mute testimony to hours of experimental labor. But they were devoid of furnishings. There was a strong ammoniac smell in the air of these rooms that almost choked me. In one drawer I found several blunt scalpels. All the other drawers I examined were empty, save for dust mites and spiders. After much searching, I located the spot in the floorboards through which the blood had seeped a few nights before. It seemed to have been etched clean with acid. Aqua regia, judging by the odor. I glanced around at the walls then, and noticed other patches, some large, others small, that also seemed to indicate recent cleaning. I must confess to feeling rather a fool at that moment. There was nothing here to excite alarm, nothing that would rouse the faintest trace of suspicion in even the most per- eh, perspicacious policeman. That was less a big word thing, more my stumbling. And yet, the sense of dread refused to wholly leave me. There was something about the oddly decorated parlor, the smell of chemicals, the meticulously cleaned walls and floor, that troubled one. Why were these hidden backrooms clean, while the parlor had been allowed to gather dust? It was at that moment I remembered the basement. Years before, Lang had asked in an offhand way if he could use the old coal tunnel in the basement for storing excess laboratory equipment. The tunnel had fallen into disuse a few years earlier, with the installation of a new boiler, and I had no need of it myself. I had given him the key, and promptly forgotten the matter. My feelings on descending to the cellar stairway behind the cabinet can scarcely be described. On one occasion, I halted, wondering if I should summon an escort. But once again, sane reasoning prevailed. There was no sign of foul play. No. The only thing for it was to proceed myself. Lang had affixed a padlock to the coal cellar door. Seeing this, I was momentarily overcome by a sense of relief. I had done my utmost. There was nothing else but mount the stairs. I even went so far as to turn around and take the first step. Then I stopped. The same impulse that had brought me this far would not let me leave until I had seen this bad business through. I raised my foot to kick in the door. Then I hesitated. If I could contrive to remove the lock with a pair of bolt cutters, I reasoned, Lang would think it the work of a sneak thief. It was the work of 5 minutes to retrieve the necessary implement and cut through the hasp of the lock. I dropped it to the ground, then pushed the door wide, allowing the afternoon light to stream down the stairway behind me. Immediately upon entering, I was overwhelmed with far different sensations than those that had gripped me on the third floor. Whatever work had ceased in Lang's chambers was, clearly, still active here. Once again, it was the odor I noticed. As before, there was a smell of caustic reagents, perhaps mixed with formaldehyde or ether. But these were masked by something much richer and more powerful. It was a scent I recognized from passing the hog butcheries on Pearl and Water Streets. It was the smell of a slaughterhouse. The light filtering down the rear stairs made it unnecessary for me to ignite the gas lamps. Here, too, were numerous tables, but these tables were covered with a complicated sprawl of medical instruments, surgical apparatus, beakers, and retorts. One table contained perhaps 300 small vials of light amber liquid, carefully numbered and tagged. A vast array of chemicals were arranged in cabinets against the walls. Sawdust had been scattered across the floor. It was damp in places. Scuffing it with the toe of my boot, I discovered that it had been thrown down to absorb a rather large quantity of blood. I knew now that my apprehensions were not entirely without merit. And yet, I told myself, there was still nothing to raise alarm here. Dissections were, after all, a cornerstone of science. On the closest table was a thick sheaf of carefully jotted notes, gathered into a leather-bound journal. They were penned in Lang's distinctive hand. I turned to these with relief. At last, I would learn what it was Lang had been working towards. Surely some noble scientific purpose would emerge from these pages, to give the lie to my fears. The journal did no such thing. You know, old friend, that I am a man of science. I have never been what you might call a God-fearing fellow. But I feared God that day. Or rather, I feared his wrath, that such unholy deeds, deeds worthy of Moloch himself, had been committed beneath my roof. Lang's journal spelt it out in unwavering, diabolical detail. It was perhaps the clearest, most methodical set of scientific notes it has been my internal misfortune to come across. There is no kind of explanatory gloss I can place upon his experiments. Nothing, in fact, I can do but spell it out as plainly and succinctly as I can. For the last 8 years, Lang has been working to perfect a method of prolonging human life. His own life, by evidence of the notations and recordings in the journal. But, before God, Tinbury, he was using other human beings as material. His victims seemed made up almost entirely of young adults. Again and again his journal mentioned dissections of human craniums and spinal columns, the latter of which seems to have focused his depraved attention. The most recent entries centered particularly on the cauda equina, the ganglion of nerves at the base of the spine. I read for 10, then 20 minutes, frozen with fascination and horror. Then I dropped the abhorred document back on the table and stepped away. Perhaps I was a little mad at that point. After all, because I was still contrived to find logic in all of this. Body snatching the recent dead from graveyards is an unfortunate but necessary practice in the medical climate of our day, I told myself. Cadavers for medical research remain in critically of short supply, and there is no way to supply the need without resorting to grave robbing. Even the most respectable surgeons need resort to it, I told myself. And even though Lang's attempts at artificially prolonging life were clearly beyond the pale, it was still possible he might unintentionally achieve other breakthroughs that would have beneficial effects. It was at that point, I believe, that I first noticed the sound. To my left, there was a table I had not taken note of before. A large oilcloth had been spread over it, covering something large and rather bulky. As I watched, the faint sound came again, from beneath the oilcloth. The sound of some animal dispossessed of tongue, palate, vocal cords. I cannot explain where I found the strength to approach it, other than my overpowering need to know. I stepped forward, and then, before my resolution could falter, I gripped the greasy cloth and drew it away. The sight uncovered in that dim light will haunt me until my last day. It lay upon its stomach. A gaping hole lay where the base of the spine had once been. The sound I had heard was, it seemed to me, the escaping gases of decay. He might have thought me incapable of registering fresh shock at this point. Yet I noticed, with a rising sense of unreality, that both the corpse and the wound appeared fresh. I hesitated for perhaps 5, perhaps 10 seconds. Then I drew closer, my mind possessed by one thought, and one thought only. Could this be the body that had bled so profusely on Lang's floor? How, then, to explain the rawness of the wound? Was it possible, even conceivable, that Lang would make use of 2 corpses within the span of a single week? I had come this far. I had to know all. I reached forward, gingerly, to turn the body and check its lividity. The skin felt supple, the flesh warm in the humid summer cellar. As I turned the body over and the face was exposed, I saw to my transcendent horror that a blood-soaked rag had been knotted around the mouth. I snatched my hand away. The thing rolled back onto the table, face upwards. I stepped back, reeling. In my shock, I did not immediately understand the terrible import of that blood-soaked rag. I think if I had, I would have turned and fled that place, and in doing so, been spared the final horror. For it was then, McFadden, that the eyes above the rag fluttered open. They had once been human, but pain and terror had riven all humanity from their expression. As I stood, transfixed by fear, there came another low moan. It was, I knew now, not gas escaping from a corpse. And this was not the work of a man who trafficked with body snatchers, with corpses stolen from graveyards. This poor creature on the table was still alive. Lang practiced his abominable work on those who still lived. Even as I watched, the horrible, pitiable thing on the table moaned once more, then expired. Somehow, I had the presence of mind to replace the body as I had found it, cover it with the oilcloth, close the door, and climb up out of that charnel pit into the land of the living. I have barely moved from my chambers within the cabinet since. I have been trying to gather courage for what I know in my heart remains to be done. You must see now, dear colleague, that there can be no mistake, no other explanation for what I found in the basement. Lang's journal was far too comprehensive, too diabolically detailed, for there to be any misapprehension. As further evidence, on the attached sheet I have reproduced, from memory, some of the scientific observations and procedures this monstrous man has recorded within its pages. I would go to the police, except I feel that only I can. But hark! I hear his footsteps on the stair even now. I must return this letter to its hiding place and conclude tomorrow. God give me the strength for what I must now do. You know what? I may have started late, but that feels like a really, really fun place to end it. A really nice place to keep y'all on the edge of your seat. So I think we will save it there at the 2-hour mark for later, for next Monday. Despite my fumbles, I hope those of you who are watching enjoyed. And I hope you will come see me again. Same time, same place. Sat amongst me while I read my books. I will wish you all a good night, and a farewell.